You know, there are days I still hear the click of the deadbolt locking behind me. It's been years. But that sound, it was the sound of my childhood ending. Not with a whimper, but with the cold, calculated sound of a business transaction being finalized. It wasn't a cake they put on the table for my 19th birthday. It was a ledger. My adoptive mother, Deborah Vance, slid it across the worn formica, her eyes as gray and emotionless as a January sky over Kansas. "Happy birthday, Kai," she said, tapping a perfectly manicured finger against a highlighted line item. "Effective midnight. You are now a liability. The checks stop coming." I laughed. I actually laughed, thinking it was some sick, elaborate joke. But it wasn't a joke. It was the moment I learned the heartbreaking truth. My parents, we only adopted you for money. If you've ever had a loved one treat you like a dollar sign, hit that comment section right now and tell me the moment you realized it. Let me know I'm not alone. And if you want to see how I took everything they stole from me and used it to build a legacy, make sure you subscribe and ring that bell. You won't just get another story here. You'll get the raw, uncensored blueprint for turning betrayal into billions. The air in that small kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd eaten every meal for nearly 2 decades, suddenly felt thick and poisonous. Deborah had always been about the numbers. She was an accountant at a local firm, and she treated life like a spreadsheet, always optimizing for maximum yield. But this was next-level cruelty. "What checks are you talking about, Deborah?" I asked, my voice thin, even to my own ears. I didn't call her mom anymore. Not after the cold, sterile way she'd started preparing for this moment weeks ago, labeling my few possessions, asking for my spare house key. "The adoption subsidy checks, Kai," she replied, as though explaining simple math to a toddler. $1,500 a month, 18 years of reliable income. It covered half the mortgage and then some. Now that you're 19, that arrangement is terminated. I stared at the ledger, watching the numbers swim. $1,500. Every month, for years. I did the math in my head over $324,000. That's what I was worth. Not a son, not family, but an annuity, a tax break. I felt the blood drain from my face, replaced by a searing, white-hot shame. All the rules, all the austerity, all the character-building chores, the cheap clothes, the refusal to let me join any sport that cost money, it all clicked. It was never about raising a good kid. It was about preserving the profit margin. My adoptive father, Kenneth Vance, sat across from the table, a pathetic lump of guilt and avoidance. Kenneth was a manager at a local hardware store. He was the one who taught me to fix engines and patch drywall, always saying, "A man needs skills." Now I realized those skills were just to keep me useful and cheap. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was wearing the same worn-out apron he wore to the store, and he looked smaller than usual, deflated. "Deborah, maybe we could give him a week," Kenneth mumbled, twisting his wedding ring. It was a plea, not an argument. And Deborah shut him down with a single, surgical glance. "The room is already listed. Kenneth, the new tenant arrives Monday. We need the space and, more importantly, we need the income stream back online." She stood up and pointed to a generic canvas gym bag sitting by the front door, a bag I hadn't even recognized as mine. "Your belongings are in there. Personal items only. Anything we purchased, the laptop, the bicycle, the few books you didn't buy yourself remains our property." The lack of emotion was the worst part. It wasn't anger or sadness or even regret. It was pure clinical indifference. I was a broken appliance being wheeled out to the curb. I finally found my voice, laced with the bitter sting of betrayal. 19 years. Did you ever, for 1 second, think of me as your son? Deborah looked at her watch, the same efficient gesture she always made when a conversation was running too long. "We fulfilled our contract with the state. Kai, food, shelter, education, Medical care. You received everything you were legally entitled to. Legally entitled to. She didn't mention love. She didn't mention comfort. She didn't mention a single spontaneous act of parental affection. Because there were none. I grabbed the key to the house from the counter, along with the garage door opener, and placed them in front of her. But before I walked out, Kenneth finally stood up. He fumbled in his apron pocket and pulled out a $50 bill. It was crumpled and smelled faintly of sawdust and regret. He pressed it into my hand, his eyes finally flickering up to mine, just a second of genuine, naked sorrow. For food, Kai, until you get settled, he whispered, his voice cracking. Then he shuffled into the garage, unable to face the fallout. He was a coward, but at least he felt something. Deborah felt nothing but the relief of balancing her books. I walked out the door with that $50 in a flimsy gym bag. That was the extent of my inheritance from the people who raised me $50, and the crushing realization that my parents, we only adopted you for money. I stood on the sidewalk and heard that final, definitive click of the deadbolt. The contract was complete. My life was now measured in a plastic bag and a rapidly dwindling $50 bill, facing the harsh reality of the Midwestern autumn. I didn't know it then, but my suffering was far from over. I stood on the sidewalk for maybe 10 minutes, the $50 from Kenneth burning a hole in my hand. That money felt heavy, not because of its value, but because it represented his last, pitiful attempt at a conscience. He bought his silence with $50. I watched the windows of the house, their house, the lights still on. Everything exactly as it had been, except for the giant, gaping hole where I used to be. It was like I'd just been edited out of the family photo. The gym bag weighed nothing. A couple of t-shirts, my only pair of decent jeans, a toothbrush, and the cheap manual for engine repair Kenneth had given me years ago. That book, full of greasy fingerprints, was the only thing in the bag that felt remotely personal. Yet it was probably just another way to keep me busy and maintain the low-cost household. I started walking towards the bus stop, the Kansas City air already turning crisp. It was late September, the kind of weather that promises a brutal winter, and I had nowhere to go. The first few nights were just survival. I spent the $50 quickly, a few cheap meals, a prepaid burner phone for a week, and one night in a grim motel just to feel warmth on my skin one last time. After that, it was the cold truth of the concrete. Bus benches, library alcoves, sometimes the doorway of an abandoned storefront if I could beat the other guys to it. I developed habits fast. I learned which public restrooms had the hottest water for washing up. I learned how long I could linger in a fast food joint nursing a single cup of coffee before the manager gave me the look. And I learned what invisibility truly felt like. People literally stepped around me, their eyes darting away, as if looking at me might cost them that same $1.500 the Vances cherished. When I look back now, I realize the streets were just a harsher version of life with the Vances. Both were purely transactional. The streets offered shelter in exchange for constant vigilance and survival. The Vances offered food and a bed in exchange for compliance and the state check. Growing up with Deborah and Kenneth wasn't bad in a cinematic way. There was no shouting, no abuse. It was worse. It was toxic normalcy. Every moment was a calculation. I remember when I turned 16 and got a part-time job changing oil at a garage. I was excited. I was finally making my own money. But the excitement died when Deborah presented me with a bill, a neatly itemized invoice for my increased utility usage, household wear and tear, and what she called an administrative overhead fee for managing my schedule. She actually charged me rent. I pushed back once. I was about 17. Mom, most parents don't charge their kids for rent. She didn't even look up from her laptop. Most parents don't receive compensation from the state to house a non-biological dependent. Kai, we are providing a premium service. We taught you financial responsibility. You should thank us for this lesson. And Kenneth, he was useless. He'd just grunt, retreating into the garage to tinker with his car. avoiding any real conversation. He was a decent mechanic, but a total coward as a man. The only thing I ever asked for was a family vacation. Just once. Maybe to the Ozarks. Something cheap. I brought it up when I was 14. Vacations are an unnecessary expense, Deborah stated flatly. The interest on the savings account that money would occupy is greater than the transient memory you'd gain. Financially, it's irresponsible. That conversation taught me that my memories weren't worth the interest on a few $100. Out on the streets, shivering under a thin blanket. I tried to rationalize what they did. Maybe they were just terrified of being poor. Maybe they needed that money to survive, not just to thrive. But then I'd remember the expensive, custom shelving Kenneth built in the garage for his tools, not for my things. I'd remember Deborah's constant shopping for clothes she never wore, always citing a tax write-off or inventory management for her perpetually in-development online retail business. They weren't poor, they were greedy, and they were terrified that if they actually loved me, it might cost them something they couldn't calculate. My mind kept cycling back to the adoption records. I only knew 2 facts. I was 3 months old when they took me, and my biological mother had died shortly after my birth. I always assumed she was nobody, some young girl who couldn't handle motherhood. It was the story I told myself to justify the Vance's coldness. I was a problem no one wanted. But what if I was wrong? What if the Vances had lied about everything? The thought was a small, dangerous ember in the cold. I had no way to check, no money for a lawyer, no energy left to fight. I was curled up one night behind a dumpster near a closed diner, trying to block out the constant, low-level ache of hunger and the damp chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I was so tired. I was ready to give up. I thought, this is it. This is where the story of Kai ends. Then, I heard a sound that wasn't the wind or the traffic. It was the sharp tap-tap-tap of expensive leather shoes on the pavement, approaching fast. My body tensed, ready to fight or run. It was definitely a man, and he was stopping right beside me. "Kai Sterling," a voice asked, not harsh, but crisp and professional. "I've been looking for you." I flinched back, my heart hammering against my ribs. 3 months of being nobody, and now some sharp-dressed stranger knew my name. This couldn't be good. It felt like the Vance's contract had expired, and now some new collector was here for payment. I had absolutely nothing left to give. I was at the absolute bottom. I scrambled back, pulling the thin, damp blanket up around my neck, trying to make myself smaller. "Depends who's asking," I croaked out, tasting the stale air of the alley. The man didn't move. He was tall, wearing a charcoal gray suit that looked too clean for this side of Kansas City. He didn't hover. He just stood there with an air of patient authority. He pulled out a leather wallet, not flashing a badge, but a business card. The cardstock was thick. The name embossed Marcus Shaw. Private Investigations. "I'm Marcus Shaw," he repeated, his voice low but cutting through the alley silence. "I'm not law enforcement. I've been looking for you for 3 months, since the day you turned 19. My stomach clenched. 3 months. That was the time since the Vances kicked me out. That was the window they had calculated I'd be legally out of their hair. "Who sent you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The only people who knew I was 19 were Deborah and Kenneth, and they certainly weren't hiring a private investigator. Maybe it was some collection agency coming for a debt the Vances had hung on me. Marcus didn't answer the question directly. Instead, he pulled out a small, framed photo from an inner pocket. It wasn't me. It was a woman. She was stunning. Not in a model way, but in a way that screamed capability and drive. Sharp brown eyes the same shade as mine, a strong jawline, and a confident, almost fierce smile. She was standing in front of a sleek glass skyscraper, the logo of some major company faintly visible on the window. She was wearing a suit that probably cost more than the Vance's car. "This is Isabel Sinclair," Marcus said, his voice softening slightly. "She was your biological mother, And she spent the last 19 years of her life trying to find you. The cold seeped out of me, replaced by a massive, hollow shock. I couldn't breathe. My biological mother, not some anonymous young girl who couldn't handle things, but this woman. A successful, powerful woman. And she was searching for me. The Vances had told me she died right after childbirth, implying I was a burden she left behind. She's dead, I stated, the words tasting like rust. Marcus nodded slowly. I'm sorry. Kai. She passed away in a tragic helicopter crash 2 days before your 19th birthday. She was flying back from a negotiation to sign the final paperwork that would have legally forced the Vances to allow contact. She was coming to meet you. The air was knocked out of my lungs. 2 days. 2 days before I was free. Before the Vances lost their legal hold. Before I could finally know the truth. She died. And the Vances never said a word about any of this. She was coming for me, I mumbled, the photo trembling in my frozen hands. She never stopped looking, Marcus confirmed, sitting down on the damp concrete beside me, utterly unconcerned about his expensive trousers. That small act of humanity sitting in the filth with me meant everything. She regretted the adoption the minute the ink dried on the papers. The whole system was built to keep you sealed off. He then dropped the first bomb that truly detonated the Vances' facade. We had the Vances under surveillance for years. We knew they were blocking all contact. Isabel offered them 10 times the adoption subsidy cash just for a 5-minute meeting. They refused. They hired lawyers, threatened restraining orders. They used you as a shield to protect that $1,500 monthly check. The shame I felt earlier vanished, replaced by an incandescent, purifying rage. They knew all those years, all those times I asked about my family, all the excuses about it's better not to dig into the past. They were lies. They actively held me hostage for money, while a woman who looked like me, a woman who cared, spent 2 decades building an empire just to buy me back. She founded Sinclair Luxury Real Estate and Hospitality. Marcus continued, watching my face. Started with nothing. Turned it into an international powerhouse. Her board members joked that the company was just one massive, 19-year-long funding operation dedicated to finding you. She named her first successful development after your middle name. Every success was measured by how much closer it brought her to breaking through the legal wall. I felt dizzy. The Vances had taught me my life was only worth the cost of my upkeep. Isabel Sinclair had spent millions trying to prove the opposite. Why are you telling me this now? I demanded, gripping the photo tightly. Marcus finally gave me the answer that ripped me out of the alley and into a different dimension. He pulled out a thick, legal file, the kind that screamed power. Because, Kai, 2 things happened on March 15th. 2 days after her accident, you turned 19 and became a legal adult. And Isabel Sinclair's final will and testament was enacted. She didn't have any other children. She never married. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle on me. I was still Kai Sterling, homeless kid, shivering in a cold alley in Kansas. Isabel Sinclair left you everything, the entire company, the assets, the properties, the hotels. She left you the $61 million fortune she built while searching for you. We need to get you to the lawyer's office now. You have decisions to make. I stared at the gym bag at my feet, the bag that contained everything I owned, and then back at Marcus Shaw, the man who had just told me I was one of the wealthiest people in the state. The contrast was so absurd. I almost started laughing again. I was wearing clothes I hadn't washed properly in weeks, and I owned a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. I didn't know what to feel: grief for the mother I never knew, or pure, murderous hatred for the Vances. But one thing was crystal clear: my life, the life they said was worthless, was about to completely break its tragic little mold. This wasn't just a win. This was a total nuclear strike against the Vances' calculated world. But I didn't know then that the real fight, the fight for my soul and her legacy, was just beginning. Marcus drove me straight to a law office downtown. Not some strip mall lawyer, but a firm occupying the top floor of a skyscraper, the kind of building Deborah Vance would only ever dream of cleaning. The car smelled like new leather and quiet money. It was the first time in 3 months I hadn't been actively shivering. The lawyer, a sharp, composed woman named Miss Diaz, was waiting for us. She looked at my tattered jeans and the gym bag, but her expression held professional respect, not pity. She ushered us into a conference room with a sprawling view of Kansas City. Down there, somewhere, was the alley I'd just crawled out of. "Mr. Sterling." "Miss," Diaz began, placing a thick dossier in front of me. "Everything Mr. Shaw told you is verifiable. Your biological mother, Isabel Sinclair, was a remarkable woman. She was a self-made titan in luxury real estate. She was worth approximately $61 million at the time of her passing. And you are her sole heir. 61 million. The number felt abstract, meaningless. I was trying to process $61. Why did she give me up if she was going to spend 19 years searching? I asked, the question raw and urgent. "Miss." Diaz handed me a small, sealed envelope. "This is a private note written by Miss Sinclair years ago. Meant for your eyes only. But the legal reason is simple grief and external pressure. Your father had just passed away suddenly, and she was barely 20. Her family, who were well-meaning but ill-equipped to handle the fallout, pressured her, saying a young, grieving, single mother with no established career couldn't give you the life you deserved. They convinced her that a stable, two-parent foster home was best. She signed the papers in a haze of sorrow and regretted it within the week. It wasn't that she didn't want me. It was that she was weak and surrounded by bad advice during the worst moment of her life. That distinction between not wanted and unable to keep changed everything. Then came the part that didn't just hurt. It made me physically sick. Marcus Shaw pulled up digital files on a tablet. "We need to talk about the Vances," he said, his voice flat with distaste. "Isabel found out their general location when you were about 9. She spent years trying to establish contact, letters, gifts, legal petitions. Every time, the Vances responded with absolute hostility. Look at this." He pointed to an old email chain. It was correspondence between Isabel's attorney and the Vances' lawyer, dated 3 years ago, from Deborah Vance's attorney. "Any further attempts by Miss Sinclair to contact Kai will result in immediate charges of harassment and the application of a permanent restraining order. Furthermore, we find her attempts to buy out the adoption agreement to be financially detrimental to the child's psychological well-being. The monthly subsidies we receive are irrelevant to this matter." I saw red, detrimental to my well-being. They used my emotional health as a shield to protect that lousy $1.500. They knew there was a woman with a $61 million empire, my own mother, desperate to find me, and they deliberately lied, obstructed, and threatened legal action, all to keep their easy money coming in. "That wasn't the worst of it, Miss," Diaz added, pushing a forensic audit report across the table. "Our investigators found that the adoption subsidy money, that $324,000 intended for your care, was consistently diverted." She showed me the numbers. Deborah Vance hadn't just been pocketing it for household expenses. She had been funneling large portions of it, hundreds of dollars every month, into her perpetually failing side hustle and online drop shipping business selling cheap jewelry. She claimed the money was for your increased maintenance and education funds. "Miss," Diaz explained, "but we found bank transfers showing she used it to buy inventory and pay for her website hosting. She was using your life, Kai, as the seed money for her pathetic little enterprise." The rage was no longer hot. It was cold, precise, and surgical. They hadn't just been indifferent. They were financial predators. They stole my mother. They stole my childhood. And they stole the very money meant to keep me fed and clothed. Also, Deborah could try and make a quick buck selling tacky necklaces online. "And Kenneth?" I asked, feeling a strange mixture of pity and contempt for the man who'd given me $50. "Kenneth was compliant," Marcus said simply. He knew what was happening. He signed the tax documents claiming you as a dependent while receiving the subsidies. He's complicit in the financial fraud. I thought back to the crumpled $50. It wasn't an act of conscience. It was a pathetic attempt at insurance, a way to buy himself out of the guilt he shared with his wife. I finally picked up the sealed envelope and carefully broke the wax seal. Inside was a letter, dated 5 years earlier. My dearest Kai, if you are reading this, I failed. I failed to be strong enough to keep you, and I failed to find you fast enough. But please know this, my life's work, every building, every dollar, every risk I took was designed with one purpose: to build a legacy so loud and so powerful that no legal wall, no greedy foster parents, and no cruel state system could ever keep us apart. I built this empire not just for profit, but as an 18-year-long ransom note. I love you, my son. I'm coming for you. Isabel Sinclair. I didn't cry. I was past crying. I felt a tectonic shift inside me. The years of confusion, shame, and self-doubt lifted instantly. I wasn't the problem. The Vances were the problem. The system was the problem. And now, I had the weapon to fix it. I looked up at Miss Diaz and Marcus Shaw, who were waiting patiently. "What do we do first?" I asked, my voice steady. No longer the shivering kid from the alley, but the son of Isabel Sinclair. "I need to see this penthouse. I need to understand what I've inherited. But after that, we start the audit. I want the Vances to pay back every single dollar they stole, not just from me, but from the state of Kansas. I want this to be public. I want justice, not revenge. I thought the worst was over: the betrayal, the homelessness. I was wrong. The real fight had just begun, the fight to step out of the shadows and claim the legacy that a desperate, loving mother had built for me. And I knew the boardroom was going to be a lot colder than any bus bench. The address wasn't a bank vault. It was a tri-level penthouse loft overlooking South Beach, a property Isabel Sinclair had held for nearly 2 decades. Marcus handed me a keycard. This was her first major acquisition after she decided the company's purpose was to find you. He explained, "She kept it pristine. No one has lived here." When I walked in, I was hit by 2 things: the smell of sea air and fresh leather, and the absolute, overwhelming silence. The place was vast, minimalist, all glass and polished concrete, but it wasn't cold. It felt ready. It felt like a home waiting for its resident. My gym bag, the sum total of my 19 years with the Vances, looked ridiculous sitting on the Italian marble floor. In the master suite, I found what Marcus called the legacy box. It wasn't a dusty chest, it was a state-of-the-art, climate-controlled safe. Inside, instead of letters, Isabel had left something far more personal: a series of audio diaries, dated every year on my birthday. I picked up the recorder labeled Kai's 19th birthday. I pressed play. Happy 19th, my magnificent boy. Today, I was supposed to be there. I had a whole day planned. I was finally going to teach you to sail. If you're hearing this, it means I'm gone. But please know, every square foot of polished concrete, every ocean view you see, I built it, imagining you here. I built it for us. The Vance family may have given you shelter, but I built you a home. Please, use this place to heal. You deserve soft things. Kai. I sank onto the bed, the kind of mattress that swallowed every ache and pain I'd accumulated on the streets. I listened to those messages for hours, a ghost mother talking to a ghost son. She talked about the real estate market, her first big deal, the frustration of the legal system, and always, ending with a plea for me to forgive her weakness when I was a baby. It was an 18-year documentary of unconditional love. The emotional catharsis was instantaneous and complete. The shame of being a liability was washed away by the sheer volume of her fierce, unwavering devotion. I realized then that the Vances didn't steal a kid. They stole Isabel's masterpiece, the life she had fought to give me. But the real world, the $61 million world, wasn't going to wait. The next morning, I was on a video conference call with the executive board of Alcott Luxury Properties. The tension was immediate. Isabel's COO, Robert Finch, was waiting for me. He was a silver-haired man who looked like he hadn't missed a quarterly goal in 20 years. "Mr. Sterling," Finch began, his voice laced with polite skepticism. "Forgive my candor, but you are 19, and you appear to have stepped directly out of an adventure. This company is not an adventure. It controls billions in assets. We need proof of competence, not just a bloodline." He hit me with an immediate test. "We have a critical deal on the table, the acquisition of a beachfront resort in Fort Lauderdale. The seller is stalling, trying to shake us down for an extra $4 million before closing tomorrow. What is your call? Pay the ransom, or walk away and face potential litigation." The room went silent. The other board members were watching me, the kid in a borrowed suit. This was the moment they expected me to fold, to cede control. I closed my eyes and remembered the cold streets. I thought about the Vances. They taught me to audit the cost of everything. I thought about the homeless shelters. They taught me to read the room and see the desperation. "You don't pay the ransom," I stated, leaning into the camera. "You don't walk away. You use the legal leverage. The seller is stalling because he's overextended on another project. He needs this cash influx immediately. That $4 million isn't a negotiating tactic. It's a survival deadline for him. Finch, instruct our legal team to draft a short-term, high-interest bridge loan offer $3 million, not $4 due in 90 days, secured by the seller's primary residence. He won't take the loan, but the sheer desperation of the counteroffer will expose his immediate need for cash and force him back to the original deal within the hour." Finch blinked, momentarily stunned. The Vances had taught me to read every transaction as an exploitation of need. On the streets, I learned how to identify desperation instantly. I was using my liability years as a business strategy. Finch finally smiled a real smile. "Mr. Sterling, you just saved us $4 million and acquired the asset. Welcome to Alcott Luxury Properties." The board meeting ended with a unanimous vote of confidence. I hadn't just inherited a company. I had proven I could lead it. I was no longer Kai Sterling, the boy worth $1.500 a month. I was Kai Sinclair, heir and CEO. The next item on my agenda wasn't about profits. It was about justice. The audit of the Vances was about to begin. The first thing I did as CEO of Alcott Luxury Properties wasn't to buy a faster jet or a bigger house. It was to launch the Isabel Sinclair Transitional Academy. Isabel had acquired a stunning, underutilized resort property in the Florida Keys years ago. It had classrooms, living quarters, a commercial kitchen, and a beautiful view the exact opposite of the grim shelters I'd slept in. We gutted it and rebuilt it to be a high-level educational facility for young adults aging out of the foster care system, kids who, like me, were kicked out the minute the government check stopped. We weren't teaching them minimum wage skills. We were teaching them the Alcott curriculum: financial literacy, business accounting, real estate fundamentals, and hospitality management. I wanted them to learn how to own assets, not just service them. I wanted them to understand balance sheets better than Deborah Vance ever did. Standing on the deck of that new academy, watching the first group of scared, hopeful kids arrive, I felt my mother's presence more strongly than I ever did listening to her audio diaries. This was the real $61 million legacy. It wasn't about the towers. It was about ensuring no kid who was finally free got stuck sleeping in an alley. While I was building my future, I had Marcus Shaw keep a close, quiet eye on the Vances. Marcus didn't need to do much. Their calculated life was imploding all on its own. Remember Deborah's perpetually failing online retail business? The one she funded with my subsidy money, turns out? Once my $1.500 check stopped coming, she had to sink the remainder of their savings into keeping that website afloat. convinced it was just one more inventory order away from striking gold. It wasn't. She miscalculated the market. She miscalculated the shipping costs. She miscalculated everything but the amount of money she was losing. Her entire financial strategy had always been based on subsidized stability. My monthly check was the bedrock that let her take reckless risks. Once that bedrock was gone, the whole structure collapsed. Marcus reported that they had stopped paying the mortgage. Kenneth was working triple shifts at the hardware store, coming home smelling of stale coffee and sawdust, just to keep the lights on. They were having silent, tense fights not about me, but about the rising debt. Deborah, the woman who meticulously itemized the cost of my toothbrush, was now drowning in her own unaudited chaos. Her face, which had always been tight and controlled, was showing every single year of stress, etched with panic. The gray, cold demeanor was cracking, revealing raw, ugly fear. I knew they were hurting, but I didn't feel rage anymore. I felt a weird, detached pity. They had thrown away a life of potential love and stability for the sake of petty greed. Now, they were paying the price, not because I was actively punishing them, but because their own flawed system had failed. The final straw came when they received the foreclosure notice on the only house I had ever known. The beige house, the house of transactional comfort, was going to be sold off to cover Deborah's failed business debts. They were going to lose the very roof they'd kicked me out from under. Marcus called me while I was signing papers for the academy. "They're gone. Kai. Movers cleared them out yesterday. The bank's taking possession tomorrow. They rented a cheap apartment on the outskirts of Kansas City, the kind of place they always looked down on. They lost everything they sacrificed me to keep. I had the opportunity right then to buy the house, to turn it into something useful. Maybe even tear it down. But that would have been revenge. And I wasn't the Vances. I don't want the house," I told Marcus. "It's tainted. Let the bank deal with it. But I want the paperwork ready. The final invoice for the Vances needs to be served. Not for the money they took from me, but for the money they stole from the taxpayers of Kansas. I want them to understand the true cost of their contract." I knew what I had to do. I had to face them one last time. Not to gloat, but to close the ledger properly. The way Deborah Vance would appreciate. I needed to serve justice. Clean, cold, and calculated just like they had taught me. I was ready to return to Kansas City. Not as the shivering kid with the gym bag, but as the CEO coming to settle a debt they didn't even realize they owed. I knew the moment was coming. I was back in Kansas City, but this time, I wasn't shivering in the cold. I was standing in a bespoke suit, driven by Marcus Shaw, heading toward the cheapest, ugliest apartment complex I'd ever seen. It was the antithesis of the Alcott legacy. Marcus parked a respectful distance away. I had the legal documents in a simple manila folder. They were living on the 3rd floor, Unit 3C, the kind of place where the carpet in the hallway smells perpetually like old takeout and stale cigarettes. I knocked. The door opened slowly, and there was Deborah Vance. She looked defeated. Her hair was messy. Her signature cold gray eyes were wide and nervous, and she was wearing a threadbare robe. The cold, calculated mask she'd worn for 19 years had finally shattered. She didn't look like a CEO's wife or an accountant. She looked like a woman who just realized she'd lost the only game she knew how to play. Her eyes dropped instantly to my suit, then to Marcus standing behind me, and finally, to the simple manila folder in my hand. The realization dawned on her face not as shock, but as a sickening sense of inevitability. "Kai," she whispered, her voice husky. It was the first time she sounded unsure of anything, ever. She didn't invite me in. "Hello, Deborah," I said, my voice steady. I felt nothing, no rage, no anger, just a profound, quiet finality. "We heard about the inheritance," she said, quickly regaining a fraction of her composure, attempting to calculate. It was in the Kansas City business paper. Your mother, Isabel Sinclair. We heard the company is enormous. Look, we did raise you for 19 years. We kept our commitment. If you could see your way clear to helping us with... No, I cut her off. The word was soft but absolute. I didn't come here to discuss charity. Deborah, I came here to settle the final invoice. Kenneth Vance shuffled up behind her. He looked older than 70. Shrunken. He looked at me, and I saw genuine, raw fear. But this time, it was fear of consequences, not just fear of his wife. Kai, son, Kenneth started, attempting a shaky plea. Your mother and I, we made mistakes, but we provided shelter. That should count for something. I held out the manila folder. It does count. That shelter cost the taxpayers of Kansas $324,000. And you lied, obstructed, and committed fraud to keep receiving that money while diverting it into Deborah's failed ventures. I let the folder drop into Deborah's numb hands. Inside is a legal injunction. It's not a lawsuit from me. It's an audit notification and repayment order from the state. Miss Diaz and Marcus Shaw provided the evidence showing the subsidy money was improperly utilized and misrepresented on tax forms. Her hands trembled as she opened the file, her eyes scanning the official letterhead. She was back in her world now, the world of forms and the numbers were devastating. You have 6 months to repay the state for the full $324,000 plus interest and penalties. I explained, maintaining the clinical tone she always used. Failure to comply will result in criminal charges for tax fraud and theft of public funds. Deborah looked up at me, tears finally agonizingly welling in her eyes. Not tears of remorse, but tears of utter financial panic. We don't have that money, Kai. We lost everything. You're destroying us. Destroying you, I repeated. No, you destroyed yourselves when you decided the interest on a few $100s was worth more than the love of a child. You destroyed yourselves when you used my well-being as a shield against my real mother's attempts to hold me. I paused, looking past them both, into the tiny beige living room that replaced my childhood home. You claimed I was a liability, but you were wrong. Isabel Sinclair taught me I was worth $61 million. You were paid in full for the contract you kept. Now you pay the cost for the love you stole. Kenneth started sobbing, a broken, wheezing sound that held 19 years of guilt. Deborah, however, straightened her back. The panic turned cold again. An instinctual defense. You are just as cruel as your mother, she spat out, the last vestige of her pride. Using money to buy revenge. I just shook my head. No, Deborah, my mother used money to buy my freedom. I'm using it to buy your accountability. That's the difference between a legacy and a liability. I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. The door didn't slam. It just clicked shut, the sound of one transaction ending and another, better one, beginning. I got into Marcus's car. I wasn't just wealthy, I was free. I was Kai Sinclair, and I had taken the most toxic lesson of my life, that everything is a transaction, and used it to achieve absolute justice. The real money was never the $61 million. It was the ability to turn my suffering into purpose through the Isabel Sinclair Transitional Academy. That academy is my mother's real monument. It's filled with kids who were told they were worthless, and now they're learning to value their own potential. They're learning that a home is built on love, not ledgers. I finally made it home. Mom, thank you. This journey, from a gym bag on a cold curb to the CEO of a global company, wasn't just luck. It was a lesson in the power of resilience and the absolute cost of indifference. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been told you're not enough, or if you've had to cut off toxic people who only valued your utility, I want you to hit that like button right now. Let me know this story resonated. And if you want to keep hearing stories of people who fought back, who turned betrayal into billions, and who proved that love always wins over the balance sheet. Subscribe to my channel, ring that bell. I'm sharing the blueprints for success, resilience, and finding true family. Don't miss the next chapter of the Alcott legacy. We're just getting started.